Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our program tonight, Survival of the Friendliest. I'm Brandon Upchurch, and I will be your host for this evening. Tonight's program is brought to you by Leakey Foundation's Young Professional Group. We are a global community of evolution and human origins enthusiasts, and we inspire conversations around and understanding around evolution, and evolutionary sciences and how it applies to our day-to-day lives. So if you want to get more involved in YPG, you can sign up for our newsletter, where you can receive updates on events and the latest human discoveries and contests. And you will find a link to that in the chat section of the Zoom call right now. Also, we are really excited tonight to announce our brand new YPG discussion group board. And this is run on Discord. And this discussion board is where you can connect with other human origins enthusiasts from around the world. You can post questions, you can chat with scientists, you can share the latest news in evolutionary science. And you can also find that link in the chat section of the Zoom call. So we'd love for you to join, and we hope to see you on the discussion group soon. So before we get started, I'll mention just a few things about tonight's event. First, I want to send a huge thanks to our sponsors, the Ann and Gordon Getty Foundation, Camilla and George Smith, and the Joan and Arnold Travis Education Fund. And also, we want to remind everyone that this event is recorded, and the recording will be posted on YouTube. Also, tonight's program will include 3 parts. The first part will be a presentation from our guests. The second part will be a Q&A where you can ask your questions about the presentation. And the last part will be small group discussions where we will all break it up into small groups of about 5 or 6 people and talk about the program amongst other attendees. And I'll give you more details on how that works later in the program. If you have any questions during the first part of the program, the presentation, we ask that you put those in the chat section. We'll during the Q&A, we'll get to those questions in the order they were received, and we're going to try to get to as many of those as we can. Lastly, please stay tuned after the Q&A, and you will learn how to win a copy of our guest's latest book, Survival of the Friendliest, which I just got done reading, and I highly recommend it. I'll give you more details on how you can win that after the Q&A. So, on to tonight's main event. Tonight's guest is Dr. Brian Hare. He is the co-author of the book I just mentioned, Survival of the Friendliest, and also the book, the best-selling book, New York Times best-selling book, The Genius of Dogs. He's the director of the Duke Canine Cognition Center and professor and chair of evolutionary anthropology at Duke University. He is also a professor of psychology and neuroscience and a core member of the Duke Center for Cognitive Neuroscience. Dr. Hare's work has gained worldwide recognition through media appearances on radio, television, and documentary films. And if you haven't seen it already, I recommend his interview with Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes. It's a really good segment. So, without further ado, Brian, welcome, and please take it away.
Thank you so much, Brandon. I'm gonna just go straight to share screen here and get my slide deck up. And while I'm doing that, say what a pleasure to be with y'all. It is a great opportunity to be able to share ideas and findings with this community in particular, because the Leakey Foundation does so much to fund so much research that is so important to understanding human origins, but also understanding animal nature, human nature more generally, and topics that we're going to be talking about the next half hour or so in my talk. the Leakey Foundation has been central to supporting the type of work I'm going to be talking about, and the giants that I stand on the shoulders of. Their work was funded by the Leakey Foundation. Often students that I work with, they were funded by the Leakey Foundation. So all of that is to say, how fun to be with you, be able to share, and a small way to say thank you for all this foundation does for understanding human evolution. So with that, my wife and I wrote Survival, the Friendliest. It actually came out in 2020. And we were in part motivated to write the book because we really felt like there was a misunderstanding about human evolution that we felt we could address. And we had an exciting idea we wanted to share about sort of how and why humans became the way they are, and that's really the topic of the book. And central to the book is thinking about other animals as well as our own species. And really the thing that we wanted to address in the book is the concept of survival of the fittest, which is, I think, what most people think of when they think of evolution. The idea being that if you are an evolutionary biologist, survival of the fittest means individuals in a population that are able to reproduce and leave the most fertile offspring. Also, including definitions of inclusive fitness too, where how many close relatives and kin you also are leaving behind and share genes with. So that would be what you're thinking about is, traits where there's variation that leads to differential survival and, has a genetic component that, say, natural selection might act on. So that's what you're talking about when you're thinking of survival of the fittest. But in the popular mind, that's not at all what survival of the fittest means, I don't think. I think there's a major misconstrual of what survival of the fittest means. And I think from the very beginning of the use of that term, it has often been misconstrued for political purposes, for socioeconomic purposes, all sorts of ways of trying to create a hierarchy among different social identities. And everyone's familiar with it. The idea is basically that certain people or certain groups of people are somehow superior, and that only the superior groups or superior individuals can survive or are somehow more valuable morally. They somehow have a higher moral value. In no way, shape, or form is that what any biologist would conceive of evolution to mean. But that is what most people, I would think, and I think there's evidence for this, would really feel that survival of the fittest, or what comes to mind when they think even of evolution, is really it's a theory about hierarchy between different groups and species. So the book we wrote is to respond to that and say, well, actually, if you step back and you look at nature and you ask the question, what are the strategies that have led to the greatest success? And where is it that you've had major transitions between whole groups of organisms that became much more successful, or individual organisms that became much more successful? It's almost always a story of an increase in some kind of friendliness being the willingness to approach or interact in some new way with another individual that's in some positive way. It's not harmful to you or them. And that new type of interaction then creates this opportunity for a new form of cooperation to evolve. And I think that story is told over and over in nature. And that's what our book was really all about, celebrating, and then thinking about how it has to do with our own species, that our species is just another example of this major evolutionary thesis. So in the case of these pictures, I have plants that are flowering plants dominate the world now. They were actually relatively recent evolutionary innovation among plants. And what do? They encourage this friendly interaction, and cooperation evolved by sharing a meal to then have their genetic material or their gametes transferred and increasing pollination. And then the next picture is probably one of my favorite examples of friendliness that's a little bit of a surprise. So there's really only one terrestrial vertebrate that lives year-round in Antarctica, and that is the emperor penguin. And they can live in Antarctica year-round because they cuddle. They're attracted to each other as things get cold, and because they cuddle and get close, they keep each other warm. And there's a new form of cooperation was born, because instead of being competitive in this case, they actually are attractive and interact more. And then the final example, and this is going to be a good one for the rest of the talk, is the cleaner wrasse. That's actually the little fish that's in the mouth of the moray eel here. So cleaner wrasse are found all over coral reefs, especially in Australasia. And what do? They're tiny fish, and they do something that seems completely crazy evolutionarily. Is not only do they not swim away from predatory fish, they actually swim into the mouths of predatory fish. So they swim towards predators, and then they go into their mouths. And so that's actually how they make their living, is basically risking their lives, swimming into predatory fish. And what do? They clean their mouths, and in cleaning their mouths, they get a meal. And because they clean the mouths of the predators end up not eating them. And they have evolved this incredibly successful strategy. And because of their friendliness and attraction to a predator, they have evolved into a very successful species in a surprising way that you wouldn't predict. So survival of the friendliest is everywhere in nature. And it's an incredibly successful strategy. My own research was shifted in the direction of thinking about survival of the friendliest because of this guy. This was my childhood dog. He was a very friendly guy, and he helped us understand, started my career basically in studying dogs. Was kind of his fault by accident, because he did a thing that many Labrador retrievers do, is he retrieved balls, and if you threw a ball for him, he would run and go fetch it. And it ends up that sometimes you can see there's multiple balls in his mouth. Sometimes if you threw the first ball and he would run off to go get it, and you'd throw another ball. And when he was going to get the first ball, he wouldn't see you throw the second ball. He didn't know where the second one was. And so when he'd come back and be like, well, where's my other ball? He'd start barking, and you just point and you gesture in the direction you'd throw in the second ball, and he'd kind of run off and orbit in that direction and go find it. I mean, totally mundane thing, but it ends up, it's a big deal. And it's a big deal because it ends up that in our own species development, as young children are transitioning from basically being unable to move to toddling around, they start interacting socially in new ways, where they start pointing to things, and they start understanding when adults are pointing to things or gesturing to things, that actually means that there's something they can learn about the environment from others that they otherwise would not have been able to learn. So there's this really interesting change that happens around 9 to 12 months of age, and all of us, all normally developing people, went through this wonderful revolution where we went from being completely egocentric to understanding that when others gesture, oh, they see something I don't see, I can learn from them in this new, interesting way. And it really is the first step towards participating in human culture, and lots of later abilities are built upon this very simple foundation. So it's a big deal, and it becomes an even bigger deal when you realize that having spent weeks working with chimpanzees and bonobos, trying to gesture to them and see if they can understand human pointing and gestures, or even gestures from their own species, They really struggle with this. They don't understand when you're cooperatively communicating. They understand so many things, but this is one thing that they really struggle with. It ends up that one of the things I discovered was that dogs are more skillful at understanding human gestures than our closest primate relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos. So it's a surprise because you'd think that humans and chimpanzees, being so closely related, they'd be more similar almost in every cognitive way. But when it comes to this thing that's vital to human development, this cooperative communicative ability, dogs really are special and look very human-like. So what does that have to do with friendliness? Well, in trying to understand where this human-like ability came from, I traveled to Siberia and had this wonderful experience of working with a population of foxes that were bred over many, many generations to be attracted and want to interact with humans, sort of in a similar way that cleaner wrasses want to interact with predatory fish. These foxes have been bred over 40, 50 years, now it's 60 plus years, to want to interact with people. And the original population of foxes was quite fearful and didn't want to be near people. So having a response more like this fox on the left. And then after many decades of people selecting them, they actually don't interact with them. They just look at large populations and they choose the foxes that are the friendliest, and they only breed together the friendliest 1% of foxes each generation. And after carefully selecting only for friendly foxes in an experimental line, they ended up with very friendly foxes after 20, 30 generations of selection. And the foxes in the experimental line, they like to be with people. They like to be held by people. They wag their tails when they see people. They bark, they cry. And I got to go work with them and ask the question, well, are these foxes that have been selected to be friendly and show traits of domestication compared to the control line that was also kept, and they were bred randomly for how they interact with people? And I got to ask the question, if I gesture and see if they can find things, let's say if I'm pointing to one of these hiding locations and there's a treat inside, can they find the hidden treat like a dog can or like a human child can? And the answer was the experimental line is really good at it. The control line actually is not good at it. They look like kind of like the chimpanzees and the bonobos. They really struggle with that. So that argues for the fact that the friendly foxes being selected for friendliness actually got better and increased in their ability to cooperate and communicate as a result of selection for friendliness. You'd think you'd had to have selection to be smarter, to be more cooperative and communicative like a human, but it ends up really all you needed was selection for friendliness, and you have this increase in understanding cooperative communicative gestures. So that was really quite exciting. Subsequently, I've been doing a lot of comparisons of wolves and dogs, and we've seen the exact same result when we look at wolf puppies to dog puppies. It ends up that dog puppies as young as 8 weeks old are really good at reading basic human gestures, and wolf puppies that we actually have raised and given much more exposure to people than the dog puppies we're working with, they are not very good at reading human gestures. So what we think happened was dogs were actually selected, or sorry, a population of wolves became attracted to human settlements, waste, and garbage. And those wolves that were able to approach, and this would have been before agriculture, so these would have been wolves interacting with foraging populations. The wolves that could take advantage of the new resources that the human super predator was creating, garbage, waste, etc., they would have been at a selective advantage because they would have had a new, really wonderful resource to take advantage of, garbage, human garbage. But you had to be attracted. You had, like a cleaner wrasse, you had to be able to approach a predator to take advantage of this very secure, predictable food resource. And so what we think is that via natural selection, not through intentional selection by humans, natural selection actually, like in the cases of the foxes, where the experiment models what natural selection would have done, you end up seeing a lot of the changes that we think of when we think of dog domestication occurring just because of selection for friendliness and attraction to humans. And then there was a second stage of evolution in dogs that really was intentionally driven by humans. Most of that selection would have happened over the last 200, maybe in some cases 2,000 years, but in most cases in the last 200 years, most of the breeds we're familiar with evolved through artificial selection in the last couple of centuries. So that's basically what we think happened, was that a population of friendly wolves became attracted to humans, and because of their attraction to humans, like the foxes, they became more skillful at understanding humans and human gestures. And because there's a new form of friendliness that occurs, you end up having a new form of cooperative communication as a result. All right, so that's a distant relative, dogs helping us generate this hypothesis, this idea that if there's an increase in friendliness, that you can also see an increase in cooperative communication, and cooperative communication that's important, a form of communication, cooperative communication that's important to early development in humans and becoming cultural. So what about more close relatives? Could we see any evidence for this kind of process in other animals that actually were not interacting with humans, sort of like cleaner wrasses and the moray eel? So myself and collaborators, in particular Richard Wrangham and I, got really excited about the idea of bonobos, one of our two closest relatives, having undergone a type of selection for friendliness that's not that different than what we see or what we argue for the case in wolves evolving into dogs, or what we saw in the case of the foxes. And so the thinking is that this is a female bonobo, Samindwa, and in her world, the thinking is that south of the Congo River, where bonobos live, they're endemic only to the Democratic Republic of Congo, and chimpanzees live in many different countries, but they're all either east or north or west of the Congo River, and bonobos only live south of the Congo River. And so south of the Congo River, after these two species, or after these two populations, the chimp and the bonobo population split, basically the evolutionary story is one morning female bonobos woke up and they said, gosh, male aggression is terrible. This is a male being aggressive towards a female chimpanzee. So they just woke up and said, you know what, that really just stinks. Could we just stop that? And the argument is that something happened in bonobo evolution where females were able to select and show preference for less aggressive males or friendlier males. And so if you compare the two species, chimpanzees and bonobos, chimpanzees famously are known to have human-like lethal aggression. In some populations, their level of chimpicide is comparable to some populations of humans, homicide. And people have argued, scientists have argued, that chimpanzees have human-like war and murder and female coercion, and anywhere you have an adult male chimpanzee, you almost always have an alpha male. In the case of bonobos, it's very different, even though these two species are so closely related genetically, as closely related, if not more closely related, potentially, than wolves and dogs. Bonobos have, and they're very similar in terms of what they look like and in terms of what they eat and so many of their behaviors. But bonobos are so different when it comes to the level or intensity of their aggression. So no bonobo has ever been observed to kill another bonobo. If only we could say that about humans. And a big part of the thinking for why this is that friendships between female bonobos really prevents the most intense forms of male aggression, and that females likely over evolutionary time preferred and were able to express their preference for friendlier males, and were able to not only escape male coercion, but most probably remarkably infanticide, which is a huge reproductive cost for female chimpanzees. But bonobo females don't actually have to worry about infanticide. Okay. So, I'm making the case that bonobos, through females' choice, selecting for friendlier males, show less intense aggression. So, in that sense, they're been selected for friendliness. Um, what about cooperation and communication? Well, one example, and it was the one that kind of rocked my world because I was so surprised by their behavior. We have found really exciting types of cooperation that we think are a product of the new types of friendliness that bonobos are capable of demonstrating if they evolve from a chimpanzee-like common ancestor. So this is just a schematic of an experiment we ran at Lola Ya Bonobo, which is a place we've been very lucky to work with. It's the only orphanage for bonobos that become orphaned through the bushmeat trade. And we go to Kinshasa, where Lola Ya Bonobo is located, and we work with orphan bonobos of the bushmeat trade. And of course, they've been there for a long time, so many of them are adults. And so all our research supports the conservation efforts of that organization, but we can do fun experiments that are enrichment and they enjoy, and we can learn about them too. So this is one of those experiments. A bonobo just comes into a room full of yummy food, and there are two keys to doors, one on the left, one on the right. And the bonobo's choice is basically eat all the food or open one of these doors, and they can let in either a group mate that they are typically in a group with during the day, or they could open a door and let in a stranger, someone that they've actually never had a physical interaction with and never been in the same physical space with. Now, if you were a chimpanzee, and maybe even a lot of people, probably you'd want to share with your group mate because that's your friend and somebody you know, and who knows what the stranger is going to be like. But what we found in the bonobos is that when they share, they don't always share. A lot of times they'll just go in and eat the food, but they more often than not, they do share. And when they do share, they prefer to share with a stranger or an individual who is completely unfamiliar to them. And that's kind of a really fun discovery, that they are xenophilic. They're attracted to new individuals and want to potentially make new friendships. And in these experiments, we never had a fight or any problems like that. They just ate the food and had fun. And one of the other surprises we found, and I didn't predict this is one of the fun things when you do these studies, the animals surprise you so many times. So the bonobo that had the choice of letting in the first bonobo, often about half the time would let in a stranger. But about half the time, this stranger came in and they didn't eat the food. They would walk over and they would actually open the other door for the other bonobo that was also strange to them. And if you're a chimpanzee, this is a terrible idea because now you're outnumbered by a neighboring group that could be very hostile to you. But in the case of bonobos, they love to be with strange bonobos. And it was just totally exciting and remarkable that they not only are so show friendliness, but it expresses itself in this cooperative behavior. So here's a video of Sake, a 4 or 5 year old young bonobo, but we also had adult bonobos showing these same behaviors. So there's food here, delicious. She doesn't eat it all. She goes and grabs something, and then she goes and opens the key and lets in another bonobo, Wendy there, and they just sit and eat the food together. And sharing is fun. Okay, so to back up just quickly, the take home is both in the case of dogs and bonobos, I think we have evidence that new forms of friendliness evolved. In the case of dogs, an attraction to humans. In the case of bonobos, an attraction to strangers in other groups. And we see new forms of cooperation express themselves as a result of this new type of friendliness. Well, what about our own species? I think this has been a big part of our own species evolution. I think that it becomes really, really clear when you think about, and in this crowd, I don't think it's hard to help you imagine that this becomes really easy to think about when you recognize that there were many species of humans And many of these species were around as late as 50, 100,000 years ago. And so recognizing that we are not the only human species that evolved, and that many of these species in our genus Homo were extremely successful. And in the case of all these species, they all had big brains, many of them with absolute brain sizes that approach a modern human's brain size. They all left behind toolkits and tool assemblages that have a high degree of complexity. Many of them have behaviors, or people have argued that many of these species have left behind evidence for communication that we might even recognize as being some kind of linguistic or proto-linguistic capability. So in that sense, the typical things that we use to define human, big brain, amazing toolkit and cultural abilities to have language and quickly innovate. I mean, we see evidence for that across all human species in our genus. And so really, that presents a real problem, because what big brains and tools and this communicative ability predicts is actually extinction, because all those species went extinct. So it must be something more, something in addition to those traits, some special thing about us that allowed our species to thrive and supplemented those traits that we always think of as so important to the genus Homo, that gave our species over the last few 100,000 years an advantage. And I think it's a new form of friendliness. I think that our species evolved a new type of social relationship and social interaction that then supercharged our cooperative ability. And I think it's evidenced by this picture right here. For those of you who don't like Duke basketball, I apologize, but it's just such a great illustration. These are Duke students. They're in Cameron. They're Cameron crazies. They are from all over the world. They are from all over the country. That none of them had met before they arrived at Duke. Very few of them anyway. And they were complete strangers to one another. Yet within months, in interacting at Duke University and taking on the Duke identity, they have become one thing. They've become Cameron crazies. They've become Duke students, and they have a shared social identity. So our species has this incredible ability to form friendships with strangers that share a common social identity. I don't think there's any other species on the planet that can do that. And so that new social category, I think, really supercharged our ability to innovate and put our cultural abilities in a new place. And so the argument goes like this: when you are another species of Homo, you're pretty much xenophobic. You're afraid of your neighbors most of the time. There is some exchange between groups. If each of these pictures represents different groups of humans, there's some exchange, people going between, but there's not that much. And so that means not only are there not interactions or individuals going between groups, but there's not that much information. As soon as you have this ability to form group identities, you can have all sorts of exchange, because as long as your neighbor shares some social identity, whether it's how they talk or how they cook their food or the tattoos they have, as long as there's something that allows you to identify, oh, okay, I've never seen you before, but you're part of my social group. Now I can really quickly form a friendship with you, and a friendship so deep, it's like a family member. And that's the thing about the Cameron crazies that's so great, is it just illustrates how it's not just a friendship, it's almost like a family. They call it the brotherhood at Duke. And so these types of in-group strangers, I think, are critical to explaining what makes us different. I think that new type of friendliness really changed the evolutionary trajectory for our species. And I think we've gone through, and in the book, and sort of made the case for why there's different types of evidence for why that might be. I think the most fun one is, well, wait a second, what's our curly tail or our floppy ear? If you're saying we're kind of the equivalent of the foxes, and that there's been this sort of self-domestication through selection for friendliness, what are the floppy ears or the curly tails? I think it's our white sclera is one of the great tells that we've been selected for friendliness. So all humans have white sclera. If you ever find a human that doesn't have white sclera, that isn't some kind of immune problem, I need to know immediately. That would be awesome. But as far as we know, there is no evidence anywhere in the scientific literature that any human doesn't have white sclera. It is the most universal morphological trait on our bodies. Everybody has it, and it's how we identify, and it's how our brain, even as young infants, recognizes another human as being human. And this is very strange because almost every other primate spends metabolic spends energy to create melanin to actually darken or hide or reduce the contrast between their pupil, their sclera, and their skin around their eye, because they don't want other individuals necessarily to see where they're looking with their eyes. Humans, we advertise it, and I think this is a great example of our friendliness leading to a new trait that probably evolved as a byproduct initially, and then became universal and allows us to cooperate and communicate in new ways because we're advertised. We want people to see where we're looking, and it helps us cooperate and communicate. All right, so in my last couple of minutes here, I'm sorry, it looks like I'm going to go over a couple of minutes. I apologize for that. But let me turn and say, yes, I'm just trying to make the case, the crazy case, that our species, Homo sapiens, are the friendliest species of human to evolve. But I also read newspapers, and my wife and I read newspapers, and making this case, we were well aware that, well, if we're so friendly, then how do you explain all the difficulties that our species creates for one another? Well, I think this same idea helps us explain the darker part of our nature as well. So I like to, and Vanessa and I like to talk about this as sort of the mama bear model of human psychology, which is when you see a female polar bear with her offspring, and they're playing and friendly and loving, it's really the most beautiful, most nurturing thing you can imagine. But that same mother, if she feels that her offspring are threatened, she's the most deadly thing you could imagine. And she's willing to take on much larger threats, larger bears, whatever it is, to protect her young offspring. So the love for kin leads to the potential for tremendous aggression, defensive aggression, for those that you love when they're threatened. And I think it's the same case for humans. It's just that instead of it just being our offspring, our kin, our direct relatives, it's also for our social identities, our group identities that we bond with, and we view as important emotionally as our kin, even though they're not necessarily closely related to us. Our social identity groups feel like kin, and while we can be so friendly and incredibly nurturing and wonderful like a mama bear to those we see as sharing something with us in terms of a social identity, when we feel our social identity or those in it are threatened, we, like a mama bear, are willing to do anything to protect those that we share a social identity with. And that can ramp up to the extreme of even dehumanization, where we don't recognize other humans or members of another group of humans who don't share a social identity as not being fully human, not actually deserving of full moral recognition. So we talk about all this in the book. And of course, I think, the evidence for the darker side of our nature being a human universal bears out when you think about how awful humans can be. As an example, Vanessa and I did a quick search, and it's not that hard to do, to just ask the question over the last couple hundred years, where has there been democide and genocide? And basically everywhere across the world you look, there's evidence for groups of people trying to wipe out and murder and kill other groups of people based on social identity. Okay, given that we are the friendliest human to evolve, but we also have this need to defend those that we feel share our social identity, what do we do to have a friendlier future? I think the positive story is that actually democracy leads to more friendliness. So if most primates have relatively despotic interactions with one another, I think humans, foraging bands of humans, tend to be much more egalitarian. And I think that probably what happened as we have agriculture is, and others have argued this being the case, that archaic states started to move back towards more despotism. And it really is when you have constitutional democracies that societies move more in the direction of egalitarianism. And it's the first sort of form of government where large numbers of people can live together and interact in a more egalitarian way, like small groups of foragers do. So first, I would say democracy is a fantastic solution to a friendlier future, and there's very strong evidence for that. And then the next one is thinking about the bouquet model, I like to call it, of social identity. Often social identities are sort of pitted against each other. They're competing against each other. It doesn't matter what the identity is. We can see them as competing against each other. But the bouquet model, and actually E pluribus unum was in part as a motto for the United States, motivated by thinking about a bouquet of flowers, actually. So this bouquet model of identity, the idea is that if you can have people realize that different types or groups or identities of people, they're interdependent, they need each other. And if you can foster cross-group friendships like Cameron Crazies, then you can create social identities that are shared, and you can really encourage a friendlier future. Okay, with that, I will stop and thank you. I'm sorry I went 5-6 minutes over, but I'm really looking forward to all your questions and having a conversation. I can explain things better, hopefully based on your questions. And again, it's a delight to be here with y'all. Yeah, I look forward to the rest. Thanks so much.
Cool. Thank you so much, Brian. I was really insightful, and I think one of my biggest takeaways is I need some more bonobos in my life. So I'm gonna start working on that. So right now we are going to move to Q&A. So if you do have a question, please drop it in the chat. We'll get to those here pretty quickly, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. So while those questions are coming in, I just want to share with you how you can win a copy of Brian's latest book, and also a Leaky Foundation tote bag. So in the chat section, you should see a link to a short feedback survey for tonight's program. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on what you thought and how we can improve. So it only takes about 2 or 3 minutes to complete it. And once you submit it, you're automatically entered into the contest. With that said, I will start us off with our first question, Brian. And this is actually something that you alluded to a little bit in the presentation, and it's also in your book, and it has to do with intelligence. In your book, you describe intelligence as a byproduct of the evolutionary process. And I'm curious to learn a little bit more about that and how you came to that conclusion.
So normally when, the most straightforward way to think about a new trait evolving, we all learned about mutations in introductory biology class. Maybe a new mutant gene appears, it creates some new protein that creates some new pathway or behavior, and it is advantageous. And so that advantage is then passed on because that individual that has that mutation passes it on to offspring, and then that trait or that allele then increases in the population. So the idea of byproduct is kind of different than that. It is that it's not that there's direct selection on, say, a mutation for intelligence that leads to intelligence. In fact, in the examples I'm giving, the argument is that animals are interacting, and in some environments, some ecologies, being friendly is a huge advantage. And so individuals that are in a population, there's some that are more willing to approach and be friendly towards certain social interactants than others. And in some environments, those individuals that are a particular advantage. And so they have more offspring. They pass on this type of friendliness to future generations. And it just happens that because now you're having a new type of social interaction that was never had before. So let's take the case of the foxes. The foxes are being selected to be friendly to people. Well, normally what a fox does is it runs away. So it's not sitting around trying to read the gesture of a human. It's running. And so now when it's been selected to be friendly and to be interested and curious and want to play and be near you, and now all of a sudden you gesture like, oh, I'm going to use my old ability to read behavior of other social interactants, and I'm going to use it with my new social partner, a human. And it just happens my new social partner is, a human, pretty smart. So this is going to be a great relationship to have. And so that's the idea, is that basically it's an emergent or byproduct of property. It's a byproduct of selection for friendliness. It's not that natural selection was acting on the ability to increase your cooperative communication. It happened as an accident of that selection. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, very cool. Definitely a different take on the evolution of intelligence. Thank you. So next question comes from Warren, and Warren asked, have scientists identified human genes that contribute to friendliness?
Yes. Human friendliness. Yes. So there are people, there's folks who have worked with dogs and tried to identify genes actually in dogs that might be involved in friendliness. And there's also folks who have worked with people who have Williams syndrome. And it's a developmental pathway where people who have Williams syndrome it's kind of, if you know anything about the autism spectrum, people who are autistic often are nervous around people and don't necessarily feel comfortable interacting with people. And Williams syndrome, it's completely the opposite. They are very much attracted to new people. They want to interact with new people, and they're hyper social. And so there has been an argument made that some of the genes that are modified that lead to Williams syndrome are some of the same genes that lead to extreme friendliness in some dogs. So there has been work done in this direction. Now, the thing to understand, though, of course, and this is a sophisticated crowd, but just to reinforce, every behavior is driven by dozens, hundreds, thousands of genes interacting. And so behaviors are sort of known as complex traits. And so if you find a set of genes or, areas in DNA that are related to behavioral differences, it's only going to explain a small proportion of differences between individuals. And so there's a lot left to do, is what I'm saying. It's a very hard, complicated problem. But there has been progress, I guess, is the point.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks. Okay, next question is from Sarah, and Sarah asks, why can dogs recognize pointing and different human facial expressions, while other domesticated animals cannot? Or is this behavior seen in other animals?
So lots of other animals can learn to read human gestures and interact with gestures and really interact with humans in really interesting and complex ways. Lots of animals can be trained through lots of practice. Lots of animals who live in human homes learn to interact in quite sophisticated ways with humans, maybe in ways that are more sophisticated than dogs. I think the critical thing to understand is that when a dog is born, they are prepared to communicate with humans after very little interaction in a way reminiscent of how humans interact with one another. And any other species that is able to do that has to have tremendous amount of exposure and experience with humans early in life and probably continuous through life to show any ability that remotely looks like what dogs can do. Now, that's the one caveat is other domesticated animals. Often people ask me about cats, and the answer there is I don't know. And the reason I don't know is no one has done a comparison like we've done, where we have the domesticated or the wild type progenitor species that led to the domesticated animal, like we do with wolves and dogs. We don't have the wild cat in captivity that's been compared experimentally to cats that are domesticated. And so the prediction is if domestication shaped cats to be dog-like or more human-like, then looking at wild cats to domesticated cats, we'd see the same differences we see between wolves and dogs. That study's never been done. So can cats use human gestures? Sure. Have they been shaped by domestication the same way that dogs have been? I have no idea because the comparison hasn't been done.
Great. Okay. Next question is from Warren again. And Warren asked, is there any evidence for epigenetics affecting human friendliness?
Ooh, Warren, epigenetics is so dicey in the sense that if what you mean is because people think of it as different ways, people define epigenetics so many different ways and think about it different ways. But how about we just go with early life experiences altering the expression of genes in really interesting ways. And yes, one of the main hypotheses for what happens and why you have byproducts, domesticated byproducts. When you select for friendliness, why do the foxes that have just been selected for friendliness, why do they have higher levels of curly tails or floppy ears than their control population? And the argument is that, well, the selection for friendliness actually altered how some of their physiology develops very early within the first weeks after fertilization, after egg is fertilized by sperm, as the zygote is organizing and the head first starts forming, there is like a little location just below the head called the neural crest that appears for about 2 weeks. And there are a bunch of cells that proliferate, stem cells that proliferate from the neural crest. And the argument is that if you're going to have a friendlier animal, you have to change how that crest expresses itself and sends these pluripotent cells throughout the body. And so in changing how cells that lead to the adrenal gland development, which is related to stress response, well, you're also changing these stem cells that do things like build cartilage or are involved in skull shape or face shape. And so in that sense, it is epigenetic. The byproducts are a result of an alteration in development really, really early that affects one system, but as a byproduct affects a lot of other systems. So I don't know. I hope that helps. That's one of the big hypotheses of what's going on.
Very cool. Okay, next question is from Nikki. Nikki has a couple questions. Do we know what sections of DNA for dogs, foxes, and bonobos are associated with friendliness? Is this section of DNA different between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens,
Ah.
or bonobos and chimpanzees?
Well, wouldn't that be cool? Yes. Let's fund that. That's the right study. I'd say the short version is we don't know, but we certainly have some really cool hypotheses and some ideas of where to look and what to look at. So, unfortunately, testing the good part about this hypothesis, which is also called the self-domestication hypothesis, the good thing about it is it's very falsifiable in many ways, which that's a good hypothesis. The bad part is it's actually a quite sprawling hypothesis because it kind of goes all the way from, genes to the most complex cultural behavior. And you almost have to measure at all these different levels to be able to test everything. And then you have to do it in lots of different species as you're predicting. So we're not quite there yet. That would be totally amazing. For instance, what would be wonderful, and we've made attempts at this, but frustrated attempts, I would say, of trying to look, for instance, at oxytocin vasopressin expression or gene transporter genes and things that are related to, or even where these neuropeptides have receptors, in what density they have them in dogs and wolves or bonobos and chimps, and then maybe using that to then get back to comparisons to Neanderthal and human genomes. But it's very difficult work, is the short version. And the reason oxytocin and vasopressin are interesting is because the thinking is that might be related to, think of it as sort of testing the mama bear hypothesis, I guess. Yes.
Okay, next question is from Cheryl. With modern issues like the pandemic lockdown and isolation, or the reliance of technology to communicate, is our species becoming less friendly? How would you measure this?
Our species is not becoming less friendly. In some sense, political polarization, for instance, is an expression of friendliness. It is, you are becoming protective of your social identity that you care about as if they are kin, and you feel that they are threatened. And so it is an expression of our unusual friendliness that we have this horrific political polarization. And so basically what you learn from thinking this way is that, think of the mama bear hypothesis. It's that the real fear, the real threat or challenge is that what makes us so friendly is our love for our group identities, but it's also what makes us so dangerous to each other. And so, no, as a species, we're not becoming less friendly at all. We've just found ourselves in a world where we keep convincing ourselves that our social identities are threatened by other social identities. And so it's we've seen an enhancement of basically the mama bear coming out and wanting to protect those that they love. And so when we didn't talk about it, we talk about it in depth in the book. There's a model of dehumanization and that this hypothesis sort of puts forth. And the argument is that because we love our social identities so deeply, it allows us to cooperate and communicate with each other in ways that other humans were not able to cooperate and communicate and have amazing cultural innovation. But that same cognitive set of abilities, when we feel that our social identity is threatened, we deny the full mental capability that we see in our own group. We deny that to those that we feel threaten our own group. And that is the quick path to dehumanization. The argument is that the same part of our mind that allows us to show empathy, to understand how others are feeling or what their intentions are, that sort of becomes muted towards groups that we feel threaten our own. We don't see them as fully human, and therefore we can morally exclude them. And so the question then becomes not are we becoming a less friendly species, but given if this is the correct or even half correct model of human nature, how do we build environments so that we express the friendlier side and we have these shared identities where we see interdependence and we don't always have these identities competing against each other in our minds?
Okay. All right. Next question comes from Ronnie. Are there any non-domesticated species that are as responsible to signals across species? Maybe wild corvids?
Wait, say that again. Who are they responsive to?
To signals across species.
Across species. Oh, I'm sure there. I'm sure. No, I don't think the ability of humans and dogs to communicate with one another and understanding cooperative communicative intentions between dogs and humans is somehow completely unique in nature. Even cleaner wrasse and predatory fish. I didn't get to go into the details of it, but even that is remarkable how that works. I mean, there's communication going on there that's amazing. And so yes, I have no doubt that there are species that are have friendly relationships between them and cooperative alliances are born, and then that allows them to cooperate, communicate in new and interesting ways, for sure. Yes. And I mean, maybe there even others, there are other examples of humans interacting with other non-humans. There's the honey guide in Tanzania, East Africa. It's a bird that actually communicates with foragers that are looking for honey, and it kind of guides them to where they can find honey. And there's all sorts of communication going on there. And it's a cooperative relationship that's born from friendliness. So dogs aren't even unique in, showing this ability. We just know in the case of dogs that it's a result of this selection for friendliness.
Very cool. Okay, and we have time for one last question. This is an anonymous question. What is your favorite unlikely animal friend combination?
That's the anonymous question. Oh, okay. I was worried there for a second. Like, ruh-roh. Okay, my most what was it? Unlikely friendly animal combination?
Unlikely animal friend combination.
Oh gosh. Well, that's a really cool question, and I'm a little bit stumped. There's so many examples of anything from clownfish to sea anemone, or in the ocean. There's so many. There's eels that work with groupers to fish on coral reefs, etc. Mongoose that pigs will lay down and let them get the parasites off them, etc., etc. But in those books, there's so many books that are like these best-selling books of animal friendships. One funny thing to note is it's very interesting. The majority of the pictures, because I love those books too, and I look at them, I'm like, oh, look at them, they're friends. Isn't that beautiful? Whatever. Most of them, if you look, it's a dog that became friends with an animal when it was very young. So I do think that dogs have this special, remarkable ability to sort of be friendly towards not just humans, but lots of different animals. And maybe that'll take me to my favorite friendship, which is my picture on my talk, which is bonobos being mothered by, there was a dog at Lolea Bonobo, and her name was Mystique. And she often, the orphan bonobos, when they first came in, they would be comforted by her, and so that was pretty remarkable.
Very cool. Okay, well that concludes our Q&A. Thank you everyone for the great questions. Brian, thank you so much for the presentation and fielding our questions. Really insightful. And I also want to say a huge thanks to Ariel Johnson. Ariel is our education director, and she is the one running the show behind the scenes and she is an absolute sorcerer at putting together not only our virtual events, but our in-person events. So thank you so much, Ariel, for making all of this happen. We really appreciate it.